In today's episode, we follow a couple from a quiet suburb of Boston who arrived in Zermatt convinced that a Disneyland ride and a Toblerone wrapper had told them everything they needed to know about a 4,478-meter Alpine peak. The Swiss guides who met them at the train station knew within 5 minutes what kind of expedition they had been hired for. What happened on the Hörnli Ridge 11 days later was the kind of failure the older guides in Zermatt have a specific term for. It is not a kind term. It was July 26, 2022, in Zermatt, Switzerland, a car-free village at 1,608 meters in the Mattertal Valley below the Matterhorn's north face. The mountain was the most photographed peak in Europe and one of the deadliest. Roughly 500 people had died on it since the first ascent in 1865. Most of those deaths were on the standard Hörnli Ridge route, which was the route every commercial expedition climbed, and the route most underestimated by people who had only ever seen the mountain from postcards. Zermatt's guiding tradition went back over 150 years. The town's Bergführer, the certified mountain guides, were the descendants of the men who had first opened the route, and they brought to the work a directness with clients that some Americans interpreted as rudeness, and that experienced clients understood as one of the things keeping them alive. The local saying was that the mountain was honest. The guides considered it part of their job to be equally honest and to be so before the mountain was forced to. David Pemberton, 39, and Allison Pemberton, 36, arrived in Zermatt by train on a Tuesday in late July. They had been married for 11 years and had 2 children at home in Newton, Massachusetts. David worked as a senior partner at a regional consulting firm. Allison ran a small interior design business. The Matterhorn climb was a milestone trip for David's 40th birthday, planned for 14 months and budgeted as part of a broader European itinerary that included Paris before and Lake Como after. David's climbing background was not insignificant on paper. He had climbed Mount Washington in winter conditions, completed a guided summit of Mount Rainier, and had taken a 10-day mountaineering course in Chamonix 3 years prior. He considered himself an experienced climber. The Bergführer, who would later evaluate him, agreed that he was experienced for an American recreational climber, which was a different category from experienced for a Matterhorn climber. Allison had less background. She had hiked extensively in the White Mountains, completed a guided trek to Everest Base Camp, and had taken a glacier travel intro course in Iceland the year before. She had agreed to the Matterhorn at David's urging and had spent the previous 6 months training with a personal trainer in Newton. They booked through a long-established guiding company that operated out of the village. The fee was 1,800 Swiss francs per person for a 2-day Hörnli Ridge attempt with a one-on-one guide ratio. David had selected this company specifically because a colleague who had climbed the mountain in 2019 had recommended it. The booking required a climbing CV, references, and a phone interview with the lead guide. David passed the phone interview. He represented his experience accurately. He did not mention that his Rainier summit had been in unusually favorable conditions, that his Chamonix course had focused on glacier travel rather than mixed rock and ice climbing, and that his most recent technical climbing had been over 18 months earlier. The Pembertons' assigned guides were Andreas Zerbrugg, 51, with 31 years as a Bergführer and over 60 Matterhorn summits, and Lucas Steiner, 38, with 14 years guiding and ongoing volunteer work with Air Zermatt. Andreas was the 3rd generation of his family to guide on the mountain. His grandfather had been killed on the Matterhorn's north face in 1957. His father had retired from guiding after a 1989 incident on the Italian Ridge in which a client had died. Andreas had been guiding the mountain since he was 20. Lucas had 3 children and a wife who taught at the village school. He had taken on the Pemberton booking because Andreas had specifically requested him. Andreas trusted Lucas's judgment in technical situations and wanted backup he could rely on for an American client he had not personally interviewed. The first meeting took place on the day of arrival in the office above the Bergbanen station. Andreas walked the Pembertons through the planned itinerary, the equipment requirements, the weather window assessment, and the turnaround conditions. He spoke in English. His English was professional and direct. Allison later told her sister that she had found him intimidating. Andreas asked David to walk him through his most recent climb in detail. David described the Rainier summit in 2019. Andreas asked about specific moves on specific sections of the Disappointment Cleaver route. David's answers were correct in general, but vague on the technical specifics. Andreas asked Allison about her experience moving on exposed terrain. Allison described a section of the Tour du Mont Blanc she had walked the previous summer. Andreas noted that the Tour du Mont Blanc was a hiking trail and the Hörnli Ridge was not. That evening in the guide's office, Andreas told Lucas that the clients had been honest about their experience, but had a calibrated misunderstanding of what their experience meant in the context of the Matterhorn. They were fit. They were motivated. They had done climbing that had taught them to feel competent. The mountain did not respond to feeling competent. It responded to whether the climber could move efficiently on exposed rock at 4,000 meters under fatigue. Andreas estimated that the Pemberton's true skill ceiling was somewhere on the lower third of the road. Above that, the mountain would do what it always did with clients of their level. Lucas asked whether the booking should be canceled. Andreas said no. The clients had been honest. The conditions for the planned window were favorable, and his job was not to refuse climbers who had passed the screening. His job was to manage them on the mountain. The first acclimatization day went up the Klein Matterhorn cable car system to 3,883 meters in a short ridge walk above the cable station. The Pembertons handled it well. Their fitness was real. The altitude was a step up from anything Allison had experienced, and she reported a mild headache that resolved with hydration and rest. The second day went to the Hörnli Hut at 3,260 meters, the staging point for the Hörnli Ridge ascent. The walk up from the lift station took roughly 2.5 hours. David carried his pack efficiently. Allison's pace slowed in the final third, and she arrived at the hut with a more pronounced headache and reduced appetite. Andreas noted both observations and discussed them with Lucas. Both guides agreed to monitor. The summit attempt was scheduled to depart the hut at 4 a.m. the following morning. The forecast called for clear skies, light wind, and temperatures around -6 degrees Celsius at the summit. It was, by Matterhorn standards, an ideal window. The departure went on schedule. The first section of the route, the Hörnli Hut to the Solvay Hut emergency shelter, at 4,003 meters, typically took strong climbers 3 hours. It was a sustained scramble on exposed rock with sections of fixed rope, requiring continuous attention and efficient movement. Falling on this section was not survivable. The guides emphasized this in the briefing the night before. David moved well for the first hour. Allison moved slower. By the time they reached the lower fixed rope section, Allison was 20 minutes behind the pace Andreas had projected. He short-roped her to maintain group integrity. She was apologetic and embarrassed. David, climbing ahead with Lucas, kept calling back to check on her, which broke his own rhythm and slowed Lucas's progress. By 6:40 a.m., the group reached the Solvay Hut. They were now 90 minutes behind schedule. Andreas conferred with Lucas in German. They agreed that the summit was no longer reachable within the safe descent window, and that the right decision was to turn around at Solvay. Andreas explained the decision to David. David objected. He had paid, he had trained, the weather was perfect, and they were less than 500 vertical meters from the top. He asked whether they could push on with Andreas and let Allison stay at Solvay with Lucas. Andreas said no. The party did not split on the upper Matterhorn under any circumstances. David asked whether they could continue together at a slower pace. Andreas said no. The descent window was the binding constraint, and a slower ascent did not change it. David's response was the moment Andreas later described as the moment he knew the day was going to be longer than it should have been. David said he wanted to continue. He used the phrase, "I didn't fly across the Atlantic to turn around at the halfway point." Allison, who had been silent during the conversation, said quietly that she would keep going if David wanted to keep going. Andreas was clear. The decision was the guide's to make. The clients had agreed to that decision in the contract they had signed. Continuing was not an option. David accepted the decision verbally. He did not accept it emotionally. The descent began at 7:15 a.m. in deteriorating internal cohesion. David moved aggressively, faster than Andreas had instructed, demonstrating his frustration through pace. Allison struggled to keep up. Lucas stayed close to her on the rope. At approximately 7:48 a.m. on a section of exposed rock roughly 200 meters below the Solvay hut, David's right foot slipped on what guides later described as a classic Matterhorn rockfall hazard, a small, loose stone on a sloped rock surface that had been baking in the summer sun. He had been moving too fast. He had been placing his feet without the precision the terrain required. The slip was not survivable on its own. The rope arrested the fall. Andreas's belay technique, the technique 3 generations of his family had refined on this mountain, did what it was designed to do. David did not fall to his death. What he did do in the moment of the fall was strike his head against an outcrop, sustaining what was later determined to be a severe traumatic brain injury. Allison, 20 meters above on the rope, watched it happen. She did not handle it well. The next 40 minutes were the kind of operation Andreas and Lucas had trained for and had hoped never to execute. They stabilized David on the ledge. They radioed Zermatt. They managed Allison through a rapidly worsening shock response. They held position through a helicopter approach that the pilot later described as among the more difficult of his career. David was airlifted to the hospital in Visp. He was pronounced dead that evening. Allison was airlifted shortly after and treated for hypothermia and acute stress reaction. She returned to Newton 10 days later. Andreas sustained a sprained shoulder from the rope arrest and lasting damage to his left knee from the descent he completed on foot after the helicopter departed. He continued guiding for the remainder of that season, but reduced his client load significantly the following year. Lucas completed the season and returned the following one. Both men were cleared in the cantonal investigation that followed. The investigation noted that the guides had recommended turnaround at the appropriate point, that the client had accepted the decision, and that the fatal slip had occurred during a normal descent under conditions consistent with experienced practice. The Pembertons' 2 children were 9 and 7 at the time of the climb. The trip had been planned as a milestone for David's birthday. The Matterhorn had been on the itinerary because David had wanted to do something significant. Andreas had read the situation correctly from the first meeting. He had calibrated the client's skill ceiling accurately. He had identified the right turnaround point and held the line on the decision. None of it had prevented the outcome because the client's frustration with the decision had translated into the kind of careless movement that the mountain punished without exception. The Bergführer have a phrase for what happened to David Pemberton. It does not translate well into English. The closest version is something like, "The mountain answered the question the climber refused to answer himself." Thanks for watching. Click on the screen for more.